Well, today we get to hear from Kevin Barton, who is the District Attorney for Washington County. He was elected into office 2018 and re-elected in 2022. Prior to becoming District Attorney, Mr. Barton served as a career prosecutor in Washington County, in the Washington County DA's office. And the mission of Washington County DA's office is seeking justice and protecting the community. Mr. Barton believes in the importance of holding criminals accountable while providing opportunities for rehabilitation and ensuring crime victims and survivors receive justice. Mr. Barton is the member of many charitable and nonprofit boards and committees. He's a frequent speaker at various community groups and events throughout Washington County and has authored multiple published articles. Mr. Barton was raised locally and lives in Washington County with his wife and 3 children. He's a graduate of Gonzaga University and the University of Notre Dame Law School. So let's give a warm Rotary welcome to Mr. Barton.
Hi everyone. I'll use the microphone to make sure everyone can hear me. It's wonderful to be back here. I have nothing to brag about when it comes to Gonzaga basketball lately. It's not quite what it historically has been, and I won't talk about Notre Dame football. I love coming to Rotary groups, but I in particular love coming to Forest Grove. In fact, I will be back here this weekend. My daughter is a 5th grader and she is in a basketball tournament in Forest Grove. And I can't stop thinking about this restaurant here, Biscuitology. Have any of you been there?
Closed.
Is it really?
Yeah. My daughter worked there.
Oh man. Okay. Well, I had the best biscuit there whenever it was open last.
We'll find another one.
I'll have to, yeah. I'll need some tips for lunch on Saturday. But if you see me this weekend here in Forest Grove, I won't be dressed like this. I'll be cheering on my 5th grade daughter in a tournament. So you've obviously heard a little bit about me, and I want to talk about the work we do in the DA's office. This isn't the first time that I've spoken with all of you. I want to give an update about some things that I've talked about in the past and some things that are probably on everyone's mind. Ballot Measure 110, drug decriminalization, public safety issues. But before I do that, I want to take a step back for those of you that haven't heard from me and just talk a little bit about the DA's office and who the DA is and what the DA does. So first of all, I'm guessing that all of us, whether you've heard from me before or not, have some idea of what a district attorney does. Am I right about that? Mm-hmm. And I'm also going to guess that a lot of you get that idea from one single source. What source do you think that might be?
Law and Order.
Law and Order, that's right. That's exactly what I was thinking of. TV, right? In fact, if I say to you right now, you have the right to remain silent, anything you say can and
will be used against you.
All right, now I'm not going to ask by show of hands who here has been arrested, but I'm guessing that you all get that from TV. And that's actually a good thing. While TV is not always accurate, while there's pieces of it that aren't always correct, it does actually give all of us this baseline understanding of how the system works. And I love Law and Order for that reason. So in the DA's office, our mission statement, which you heard a moment ago, is seeking justice and protecting our community. What does that mean? So seeking justice, put simply, is doing the right thing for the right reason. And it's not always easy. Sometimes the cases are pretty straightforward. A robbery at a 7-Eleven and it's caught on camera. That's an easy case. But sometimes trying to find the right thing for the right reason, to do justice for the victim of that crime, to make sure the family members who are impacted can move forward, and also to make sure that whoever committed that crime is held accountable, but also we put him or her on a path back toward rehabilitation. Because no matter what we do, the vast majority of the people that my office prosecutes, one day they're going to come back and live in our community, and we want to set them up for success because they're living among us and they are our neighbors as well. So seeking justice is doing the right thing for the right reason. And protecting our community, that's basically keeping us safe. At the end of the day, one of the key roles of the district attorney and the police is keeping all of you and me and our family members and our neighbors safe. And what that means is you need to be safe. Like, we don't want a crime to happen to you. That's being safe. But you need to feel safe also. When you walk down the street, when you park your car and you leave it somewhere, when you go visit a friend or you go shopping, You need to feel safe everywhere you go in Washington County. And there are some places in our state right now where that's not the case. This morning, I was in Portland. I did not feel safe when I parked my car. Now, there are places in Portland that are safe, there are places that are not. There are places in Washington County where that may not feel as safe as well, and we're always working to keep those places as safe as possible. So, seeking justice and protecting our community, that's the mission. Let me share with you some good news. So some good news, first of all, we are a safe county. And I probably shared this with you the last time I spoke, and I'll share it with you again. Our crime statistics show that our crime rate is among the lowest of large counties in the state. In fact, are 30% lower than the crime rate in the state as a whole. And we're over 50% lower than the crime rate in Multnomah County. That's looking at both violent crime and what we call property crime. That's people stealing things or damaging property. So those are good statistics, good numbers to have. Also, there's a lot of good work happening in the county. And it's not just the person speaking to you here right now. I have an office that's about 150 people. We work with every single police department in the county, including Forest Grove right here. And it's the men and the women that work throughout the entire system that are the ones keeping us safe and doing that good work. A couple things we're really proud about in my office since the last time I spoke with you. Number one, we've started something brand new. In fact, it's the first of its kind in Oregon, and it's a hate crimes team. It's called a multidisciplinary team, where you bring lots of different people who look at issues from lots of different perspectives. And we meet quarterly, which includes police officers and community members and prosecutors. And we come together and we look at how can we increase the reporting of hate crimes. When things like that happen, how can we encourage people to feel confident to report it? But when it does happen, how can we hold those people accountable for that crime? Because that gets to the heart of being safe and feeling safe. The other issue that I'm really proud to report, we have a cold case grant that we've received in past years, and we got a new grant this year. So this is federal money coming in and funding positions that allow us to go back in time and investigate unsolved cases, typically unsolved homicides and unsolved sexual assault cases, where there's DNA that might have been collected decades ago before anyone even knew what DNA was, before it was on Law and Order, and we all now understand what DNA is from TV. It was collected though, and now we can use modern science and take a fresh look at some of these cases and hopefully crack open a case. And we did that this past year. Our cold case unit was able to crack open a case, and we were able to file charges on a case from the late 1980s. So happy to report those are good, positive developments since the time we spoke last. Are you ready for me to talk about some of the more challenging news?
Yes.
Okay, and this is probably a little bit of what's on your mind. And let me tell you too, interrupt me. You don't have to raise your hand, you can if you like, but ask any question you want. Nothing is off limits. I'm happy to answer whatever question you've got on your mind, and I'll save room at the end for questions too. So, first big hot button issue that we're dealing with is drugs, right? Who thinks this is a problem in Oregon right now? All right, huge problem. And let me give you a couple stories just to emphasize what we're dealing with, real stories. So last spring, we had a case come into our office, not quite a year ago. It was a 2-year-old toddler who had overdosed on fentanyl. How does that happen? Her parents were drug users, and she had gotten her hands on the fentanyl. She's 2, and she had somehow ingested it. First responders were called, the police and paramedics came, and they administered something called Narcan. Narcan is the counter agent to counteract an overdose, and it worked, but she had so much fentanyl in her system, residual fentanyl in her system, that she overdosed a second time just from what was in her body from the when she had ingested it. Luckily, her life was saved. She's doing well now. We're prosecuting the parents for making that happen to her, but that is an example of some of the fallout of what we're seeing in our communities. So that's example number 1. Example number 2, this isn't a case that my office is prosecuting, but it's something that I witnessed firsthand. So my son is a high school freshman. We live in Sherwood. He was going to the homecoming dance as a freshman. He'd never been to a dance before. So he needed a collared shirt. And so we went to the store, and the store called Tilly's. Do any of you know where that is? It's where teenagers buy clothing, apparently. It's over in Tualatin. And Saturday, he was going to get a shirt. My daughter was in the dressing room with my wife. I was just kind of hanging out, doing the dad thing, waiting, right? Looking at my phone, as I'm sure we all do. And I noticed there was this guy in the store, and he just was acting oddly, I should say. He had a lot of clothes in his arms. He had a couple workers that were kind of following him around, talking on their walkie-talkies. He was kind of looking around and just behaving strangely. Then all of a sudden, he grabbed even more clothing and made a beeline for the door. He was, running away with the clothing. And the workers were kind of running after him, telling him to stop. I did a really stupid thing. I chased after him. And you know that story of the dog that chases the car? And the whole joke is, what would happen if the dog ever caught the car?
Yeah.
So I had, as I'm chasing after him, yelling at him and trying to grab him, I had that thought in my mind, what am I doing, right? But I continued to chase after him. I went around the corner, he jumped, we were yelling at each other, he was yelling at me, he was flipping me off. He jumped in what I'm sure is a stolen van and took off. So I go back into the store, and of course by this point my adrenaline is pumping. And I asked the worker, did you call 911? And she said, no. I said, and she was a teenager, so I said, you have to call 911. So I called, and the Tualatin police responded just a couple minutes later. And they never caught the guy. I had caught part of it on video. I got in big trouble from my wife. Why did you do that? And she was in the dressing room, she comes out, I'm talking to the police, right? I got in bigger trouble from my son, who said, Dad, why didn't you tackle the guy? So no-win situation. But why am I telling this story? I'm telling the story because this is an example of how an everyday crime impacts quality of life. Quality of life for the worker. Why didn't she call? It happens all the time. That's why she didn't call. This is a routine thing. Quality of life for a shopper like me, because he could have had a weapon, a knife, a gun. He could have attacked me, anything, right? What if I had caught him? What would I have done then? That impacts the safety in our community. And the reason I share that next to the story about that 2-year-old toddler and the drugs is I know that drugs played a role in both. These days, the property crimes that we prosecute in the DA's office, when people are stealing things, almost all of them are driven by addiction. And that's not to excuse it or to explain it, but it's a reality that we're dealing with, which is the days of the greedy thief, the thief that steals because they are lazy or they want something and don't want to work for it. They're still out there, but they are overwhelmingly outnumbered by the thief who is stealing because there is an addiction underlying that crime. And while we need to prosecute, apprehend, hold that person accountable, give that person a punishment, absolutely, for committing that crime, we also, at the same time, need to figure out how do we address that addiction so they don't just go do it again and again and again. Yes?
I had a similar situation at the Walgreens in Cornelius. I'm standing there paying for my stuff when somebody just shoplifted and walked right out the door. And I looked at the clerk and I said, aren't you gonna do anything? She goes, we're not supposed to. So I mean, there's no deterrent. So anybody can shoplift, there's no deterrent. So is that because things have gone wackadoodle and business owners are going to get sued through the wazoo if they try to protect their business property? Or is it that you are so, not you specific, but the district attorney's office is so overwhelmed and our court is so overwhelmed in Hillsborough, we just can't prosecute enough people fast enough?
Well, let me answer that by starting at the end. We will prosecute every single case that comes to us, provided there's enough evidence to prove the crime occurred beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the standard that we're held to. We don't have a cutoff where if it's under this dollar amount or that dollar amount, we won't bother. No crime is too small for us to prosecute because it all comes down to quality of life. So if the shoplifter steals $10 worth of merchandise and that case comes in the door, we'll look at that case in terms of, do we file charges? We'll look at it the same way as we would look at it if it was $20 or $100 or $1,000. What we do with it might differ depending on the severity of the crime and what the criminal history of the person is. So that storekeeper always has the option of calling the police. If the police come and they do an investigation and they send that case to us to prosecute and the evidence is there to justify it, we'll file those charges. The other part of your question, why isn't the storekeeper doing more? That gets complicated because just like I should think twice before I chase after someone, you're asking a Walgreens clerk or a store manager to go chase after someone, that could go horribly wrong very quickly. So there's a calculation of risk versus reward that the companies have gone through and they've decided it's not worth the risk especially these days with unpredictable people who are dealing with fentanyl or meth or heroin addictions. You just don't know what that person might do. So it's never good to chase after someone. Don't do what I did. Call the police. And the Tualatin police, they arrived within a couple minutes. So hope that answers your question.
Did they come in a couple minutes because you're Kevin Barton?
No,
Or did they call?
Well, I don't know.
Because that
That's a
was
good question.
911 call.
No, they came, the officer arrived, I didn't recognize him, and I told him, hey, this is who I am. He says, yeah, I kind of recognized your name. So, but it wasn't, I'm convinced they came because I called 911.
All right.
Yes,
This might be a little unrelated, but it's more of a state issue. I was told, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the state of Oregon, the hospitals have when they've got two parents, and the parent gives birth to a child in the hospital, and the child is they know that it's got fentanyl in its bloodstream, that when they discharge, they're by law, they're supposed to hand the child over to the parents. Is that correct?
I've never heard of that. I mean, obviously, if someone were to give birth, the hospital can't take the child away unless there's a concern for the child's safety. And then what the hospital would do should be to call the police, who would then respond.
Okay, I was told that they just hand them over and that there's no
No.
call to the police.
No. So any medical provider, any nurse or doctor or hospital employee is what's called a mandatory reporter of child abuse. There might be some in this room right now. Teachers, lawyers, many people in our community who occupy certain positions are obligated by law to report child abuse if they become aware of it. And if a hospital worker, nurse, or doctor became aware that a child was born and had fentanyl in their system and would be in an abusive home, they would be required by law to report that, and then the first responders would come and conduct an investigation. So let me talk a little bit though about ballot measure 110. Yes?
So on Janae's story about the person at Walmart, if you're standing in the grocery, should you be calling 911?
If you
Because
ever have a concern
those
about,
guys aren't
yeah, absolutely. Yes, if you have a concern about your safety, or if you witness a crime and want to report it, you should call 911. And I think there's this general hesitancy to call 911 that we all have, because you think, well, maybe it's not an emergency, or I don't want to block someone else who might have a greater emergency than I do. And I would say just use your judgment. If something's happening right in front of you and there's a concern about safety or it's a crime that's being committed, absolutely call 911. The dispatchers and the operators, they're capable of juggling calls to make sure that the more urgent call takes priority. I called 911 a couple weeks ago. I was driving on Highway 26 to work. The guy in front of me was clearly weaving and intoxicated and speeding, so I called. I don't know whatever happened to that, but if you see something, say something.
On the fentanyl thing though, are we being flooded with these drug problems in the county because people are cooking stuff out in the county, or because something's going on with the I-5?
Let me talk about, that's a great setup for what I want to talk about. So I will answer that question in a moment. So what are we seeing right now when it comes to drugs in Oregon? So first of all, drugs and the addiction problem in Oregon is not a new thing. If you had me out to your Rotary 20 years ago, I would have a conversation with you about meth. And I would talk about meth labs and people cooking meth, or I might talk about honey butane oil and people cooking that sort of thing and creating that 20 years ago. If you had me out to talk to you 7 to 10 years ago, I would talk to you about heroin. And I would talk about the problem we're seeing with heroin and addiction and drugs and crime that follows that. And now I would talk to you about fentanyl and meth and heroin, because we're seeing the cumulative impact of all of those things together. So the challenge with fentanyl that we have is multifaceted. First, it's cheaply produced, and it's typically the precursor elements, the stuff that is used to make the fentanyl that you see on the streets. Those elements, those chemicals are manufactured overseas. So there's not much a county DA or a local police officer can do about something that's being created in a different country like China or somewhere overseas. It gets shipped then to America or to South America or to Mexico, and then it comes up the I-5 corridor. It often starts out in a powdered form. And if you watch the news and you see news releases about seizures, where a seizure was made, typically on I-5, because that's how a lot of it is shipped up, Usually the fentanyl that you see will look like one of two things. It'll be packaged in these like saran wrapped brick-like things, which is powdered fentanyl, or it will already be pressed into pill form, which looks like little M&Ms or little Skittles, depending on the colors that are used, blue pills, or sometimes they're multicolored pills. Those pills sell on the streets of Portland for less than $1 a pill. It is the perfect product in terms of transporting and shipping because it's cheap to transport and it's easy to sell. So heroin, you typically would have to smoke it or inject it. You need all the stuff to do that. Fentanyl, a little pill, less than $1 a pill, you can pop it in your mouth and you're taking it. You can also smoke fentanyl. There's other ways of ingesting it, but it's very easily ingested using that pill. And because of that, and because of how readily available it is, and how easy it is to transport it, it's almost impossible to stop it from coming into the state. That being said, a lot of work is being done by federal authorities, both internationally and throughout the nation, FBI and other task forces, to stop the amount that's coming in, but it's almost impossible to stop. Yes, sir?
Have we seen an appearance of trank or crocodile?
Yes, so that's the latest new thing. So they're basically tranquilizers that are typically used on animals are now being used by drug users as the latest or the next thing. So tranquilizers, methamphetamine, fentanyl, heroin. And so the challenge now is if we know we can't completely stop it from coming in, we should do everything we can to reduce the amount that's flowing into Oregon, and that's happening. But we have to look at it both from a supply and a demand side. So the supply side is what's coming into our nation, what's coming into our state. The demand side is, why is it coming here to Oregon? And if we attack the issue from both perspectives, both supply and demand, that's the best way to try and address this and reduce the amount that's coming. We will never, quite bluntly, stop drugs, illegal drugs, from coming into our state. We'll never stop people from using illegal drugs, but we can do everything we can to minimize the occurrence of it. And so when we get to the user side, one of the biggest challenges we've had in the last 3 years has been the decriminalization of drug possession. And that was a ballot measure that we all had an opportunity to vote on in 2020 called Ballot Measure 110. So if you watch the news, and it's almost every day in the news lately, you'll hear conversations about Ballot Measure 110, what it did a few years ago, whether it should be changed, who's pushing for it to be changed, should it be completely repealed, and should we go back to the way things were 3 years ago, should we keep parts of it and modify it? That's the robust conversation that's happening right now. My opinion on it is, there's a lot about Ballot Measure 110 that is horrible and that needs to be repealed, deleted, changed. There are, however, pieces of it that are good ideas. And the one piece that's a really good idea is back in 2020, it actually created more funding to support drug treatment in Oregon. And it was actually titled the Treatment and Recovery Act. So when you all voted on it, it wasn't titled the Decriminalization of Drugs in Oregon Act. It was titled the Treatment and Recovery Act. And I firmly believe that most people who voted on it thought that this would increase treatment and increase recovery options for Oregonians. It didn't deliver on that promise. So there's now an opportunity, I believe, to change the law so it can continue to deliver on the funding, because we want treatment programs to be funded, so when people are ready for treatment, it's there and available. That's a good thing that should continue. The piece that needs to be changed is the decriminalization, because when you make drug treatment completely voluntary, it minimizes the incentives that people have to engage in that treatment. And the powerful pull of the extremely addictive substance, whether it's meth or heroin or fentanyl, is always going to win over voluntarily someone just walking into a treatment center. Let me tell you exactly what it did. So now, if you are a police officer and you're walking down the street and you see someone ingesting fentanyl or heroin or meth or any of these really dangerous and addictive drugs, you have two options. You can either ignore it, and that's happening a lot, or you can give that person a ticket, a $40 ticket. Ironically, if you give them the ticket and they crumple it up and throw it on the ground, the fine for littering is greater than the fine for the actual act of using the drug. The law was built to say that if you get that $40 ticket, then the incentive is you can have a judge order that you don't have to pay that ticket if you would just consult with a treatment provider and consider what your treatment options are. The sad reality is the majority of drug users who receive those tickets, what do you think they do with it?
Throw them on the ground.
They throw them on the ground. They don't bother to do anything with it because it doesn't matter. Nothing happens if you don't do anything. And they all know it. So the sad reality is that that idea that would somehow spur people into treatment has failed. So what a group that I'm part of is proposing, and I've been pushing hard for this, is change that part of the law. Make drug possession and drug use in public, make that a crime again. It doesn't need to be a felony crime, frankly. It can be a misdemeanor crime, and a misdemeanor is the most serious misdemeanor. And the only reason to make it a crime is not to punish someone who's using drugs. It's to compel them to get involved in treatment, to use the built-in rewards and consequences that the criminal justice system has to compel them to take that treatment course, and if they don't, then use sanctions to punish them to compel them to engage in that. Yes?
So I want to go back to why that piece of the legislation, the mental health treatment and the addiction treatment, why that failed, and how you're going to, not you, but how are we going to ensure that if it's recriminalized, which I agree with, that we're gonna actually have the capacity and the facilities and the funding to have it flow? Like, why didn't that piece happen, and will we make that same mistake moving forward regardless of the penalty?
That's a great question. So the reality is that there's not enough treatment infrastructure in Oregon right now. If every person who's using drugs said, I want treatment, there wouldn't be enough treatment providers to actually accomplish that. So part of the reason it failed is it didn't have enough time to ramp up, and it didn't have enough dedicated funding and enough oversight. So one of the other proposals is to transfer the oversight of that program to make sure treatment providers have the funding away from the Oregon Health Authority, which is a government agency that essentially is responsible for overseeing health conditions in Oregon, away from that group and over to a different group called the Alcohol and Drug Policy Commission. It's a better group, I believe, to make sure that the structures that should be in place are in place, to make sure that the treatment providers have enough funding to be up and running. The other reason it failed is what we did with what Oregon did is, at the time in 2019 and 2020, when 110 was being discussed, the only real bridge we had to compel people into treatment was the criminal justice system. And the state tore that bridge down by decriminalizing it. And then we assumed that people would voluntarily seek treatment, but the treatment providers that have been set up, these are all nonprofits and companies and businesses that have payrolls and have obligations and have to pay rent. All of a sudden, those people weren't coming to them. So then they started to struggle because their revenue stream wasn't showing up as it ought to be. So it kind of withered away too, it stumbled, and then it's taken time to bring that back. So I believe that if we, what is the expression? If you build it, they will come.
Yeah.
I believe that we have to do two things at once in the state. A, we have to recriminalize drugs so that people can be compelled to engage in treatment, required to go to treatment. And B, we have to make sure the treatment providers have the resources, the funding, so that they will be there when the people come. And both things need to happen at once, like chewing gum and walking. You gotta be able to multitask. Yes?
Is that funding, moving that funding part of the bill, or is
Yes.
that, okay?
Well, part of the bill is a good question.
Well,
So let's
how
talk
will it
about
happen?
logistically where we
Yeah.
are. So I am part of a group that has proposed a new ballot measure that will be on your ballots next November if the legislature, who's meeting this February in just a couple weeks, if they don't fix it. So our hope is the legislature, who's meeting for what's called a short session. So every other year, they meet for a long session and a short session. This is their short session year. It's about 30 days. Our hope is that they will fix Measure 110 and make it so that nothing has to go to the ballot down the road. But I'm also a realist, and I have very little faith in the legislature's ability to actually accomplish anything meaningful for the state, given the track record that we have. And they've failed to address this known problem in the 3 years since 110 was passed. The only reason, in my opinion, that this is on their plate of things to do during this short session is because they know that if they don't do it, the group I'm part of will put it on the ballot for all of you to vote for. So I'm hopeful that they do that. If they don't, then we'll push forward and put it on the ballot, and we'll see what happens.
And then if that passes, the funding, do you have to do much more than moving that funding?
There's a lot of work a lot of component pieces to this. So One piece is making sure that the funding exists for the treatment providers to be there. Another piece is making sure that the laws on the books exist to compel people to get into treatment, and that the infrastructure is there as well, so that the police have the personnel to go, either arrest someone or to give someone a criminal citation. So there's a lot of work that has to be done, but what I've described is a necessary step to be able to move in that direction.
Okay.
That's right.
And the capacity of the nonprofits to be able to deal with it.
That's right. Capacity of nonprofits, capacity of the justice system. So our justice system is frankly overwhelmed right now with what we're dealing with. You've probably seen in the news, there's a shortage of attorneys to represent people accused of crimes. There's a shortage of judges. We don't have enough judges in Washington County to deal with the county population that we have. There's a shortage of prosecutors. So there are so many fires burning right now in Oregon. If I were to talk to you about the drug crisis or the mental health crisis or the housing crisis, there's so many fires burning. What we've got to do is start putting some of these fires out and working on more than one thing at a time so that we can make progress moving forward. Yes, sir.
Do you have to hear with the Attorney General this week?
So the Attorney General, her name is Ellen Rosenblum.
Right.
She has very little direct involvement in criminal prosecution. The Attorney General's office does handle the appeals cases. So when a case is finished in the DA's office, the Attorney General's office will handle the appellate process. But on a day-to-day criminal justice approach, the Attorney General doesn't actually have much involvement. But I do know her, and we talk whenever I see her.
And, another question, did the legalization of marijuana impact?
No, I don't. I think the legalization of marijuana, although it seems like it might be related because they're both forms of a drug, it's an entirely different
Well, I
issue.
just know when I was teaching school at
Yeah.
the middle school level, we had a drug committee, and the message was marijuana was the gateway drug, alcohol was the gateway drug.
That was Nancy Reagan's message.
Well, to be fair, I think there are challenges with marijuana when it comes to youth. And I think that if we were gonna have a robust conversation about that, we would say, look, marijuana and meth are not the same thing. It's like saying a bike and a car. Just because they both have wheels doesn't mean they're the same. However, I think there are challenges especially with our youth, using marijuana and abusing it, and the potency of marijuana today as compared to 10, 20, and 30 years ago. But in my mind, I separate these two issues.
Oh, we have time for maybe one more question, and then we're a little bit over.
Okay, yes, sir.
How is funding for your department?
Thanks for that amazing question. Yeah, well, I will tell you, this is budget season for the government departments and offices, and I spent a whole day yesterday holed up in my office trying to figure out how we're going to continue doing our work with yet another budget cut. So unfortunately, public safety in Washington County, in my opinion, has not been adequately funded over the years as our county has grown and these challenges have grown. And it's hurting the public safety that you're all seeing on the streets. The best example I can give of that is our jail right now. Our jail normally holds 572 beds. The jail now has a capacity of 388 beds. That's for the entire county of 600,000 people. Any arrest made anywhere in the county, the only place a police officer can take them is our one Washington County jail. And the jail has been underfunded, and the sheriff has been underfunded for years. So the county's not able to keep that jail at full capacity because of a lack of funding and because they don't have enough jail deputies who are employed doing that job. Same problem in the DA's office. We've been underfunded, and now we're looking at budget cuts, which are gonna make it so we can't do all the things I wanna be able to do. We can't be part of some of these specialty courts that work to address drug addiction. We can't be as involved in some of the juvenile work that we're doing to address juveniles who are committing crimes and hopefully turn them around before they become adults. So we need more funding, and the best ask I can make all of you would be the county commissioners. There's 5 of them in Washington County, and they all represent different districts of the county, and one is at large who represents the entire county. If public safety funding is important to you, please send an email. You can just Google who is my county commissioner and you can figure it out. Let them know that it matters because the squeaky wheel does get the grease.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you all.